Evening and welcome to the regular meeting, although it's not scheduled on the same regular time. We moved it up to Monday because of Juneteenth, I believe, which is Thursday. And so welcome to our regular meeting of June 16th of the Humboldt County Association of Governments. And we, in the beginning of our thing, always have this land acknowledgement. We don't read it out, but we want to acknowledge that we're here on the lands of others. And so what we will start with is a roll call, please.
Supervisor Vice Chair Steve Madrone.
Present, and I will note that Chair Johnson was not able to attend tonight.
Thank you. Councilmember Kat Napier.
Here.
Mayor Kim Burgell.
Here.
Councilmember Skip Jorgensen.
Here.
Councilmember Stacy Adkins Salazar. Councilmember Robert Orr. Mayor Pro Tem Bryce Kenny.
Here.
PAC member Natalie Arroyo. And PAC member Tatiana Alstrand.
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much for that. And at this time, we will adjourn the HCOG board and reconvene as the Policy Advisory Committee. And with that, we will take public comment on non-agenda items. Is there anybody here in the audience that would like to speak on non-agenda items? Nope. And how about on Zoom? Not seeing any hands up. Give it a second. Okay, with that, we'll move on to our consent calendar. And these are items that are considered to be routine. With a single motion, they may be approved from the consent calendar, and if removed, will be heard separately. Does any of the board members wish to remove anything from consent? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and list those items. One is the approval of the meeting record from May 15th. The other is number B, Regional Surface Transportation Program, RSTP policy and allocations. And item C is the federal fiscal year 2025 Federal Transit Administration Section 5311 Fund and the allocation request and information on the 5311F program. And item D is funding agreement between Humboldt Transit Authority, County of Humboldt, and HCOG regarding dial-a-ride service operating and administrative cost sharing. So those are the items on consent. Is there any discussion from the board? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and entertain a motion.
I move that we accept the consent calendar as written.
Motion to approve by Burgell, and is there a second? Second by Skip Jorgensen, thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and take a roll call, or do we just do voice voting?
Chair Madrone, we do need public comment on that.
I'm sorry,
as
thank
well.
you very much, Brendan, appreciate that, always appreciate the help. Public comment on our consent agenda. Anybody in the room? Seeing none, anybody online on Zoom? Seeing none there, again, thank you, Brendan. And so with that, we'll go ahead and have a voice vote, is that correct? Or a roll call?
Wait, voice
Voice
vote, but
vote.
I didn't see who the second was. I'm sorry.
The second was by Board Member Jorgensen.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you bet. And so with that, we'll go ahead and have a voice vote on approving the consent calendar as a whole. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. And with that, we do not have any items removed from consent, and our first action item is number 6A, to authorize the Executive Director to submit carbon reduction program funding allocation requests for local agency recommended projects, and I believe we have a staff report.
Yes, we do, and thank you, Chair Madrone. And I just want to thank the whole board, for that matter, for being flexible in rescheduling this meeting to this evening, recognizing that Thursday is a holiday. So thanks for your patience there, and I'm happy you were able to take the time out of your Monday to make this evening work as well. So with that, the staff report item here this evening, as you noted, is to program the remainder of our carbon reduction program grant funds, essentially. So the carbon reduction program, if the board may recall from the discussion last year when this program and its allocation for our zero emission fleet transition plan came through.
May I recognize that city council person Alex Stillman is here, and are you filling in for the city because Stacy could not be here?
No, I'm filling in actually for HCOG.
Okay.
I'm coming to HCOG for HCA.
So because Natalie couldn't be here,
Natalie can't be here today.
and there's your seat right there. Excellent.
So this, oh, okay,
Yeah,
here we go.
great. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Let it be recognized that Alex is here as the alternate. All right, please go ahead.
Yeah, excellent, and thank you. So this is a federally funded program that was part of IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And essentially, to kind of boil down how it affects us here regionally, is there was about $1.2, $1.3 million cumulatively over 5 years made available to the region to be put towards projects that ultimately help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this funding came through initially in the 2022-2023 era, and with that, HCOG staff worked to develop, again, that zero emissions fleet transition plan project, which uses a portion of this funding. And the idea at that time, after that was programmed, was to reserve the remaining approximately $1 million in funding and to program that for projects that came out of that planning effort. Fast forward to late 2024, early 2025, and again, this is a federal funded program. There's a lot of uncertainty on if this money would be one of those areas that ultimately would be, taken away or deemed unnecessary at the federal government level. And with that, we had some discussions with Caltrans staff, and ultimately their recommendation, seeing where things were going in federal funding, was to to program that funding as quickly as possible, because the carbon reduction program funding, once obligated and once you have your what's called your E76 or your notice to proceed from Caltrans, that funding can no longer be taken away. It's obligated and it can be used to complete the project as proposed. So with that level of urgency in mind, staff took that back to the TAC and ultimately put out a call for projects in the spring of this year, looking for ways ultimately to do local agency projects to use the remainder of the funding that could be programmed as quickly as possible. And that culminated in a deadline to receive local agency funding requests on May 22nd of this year. And so you'll see in the staff report there are 4 proposed projects, or 4 applicants, I should say, with 5 projects, because HTA does have 2 that came forward. One was from the city of Arcata in the amount of $216,000 to fund their bike share program. One is from the city of Blue Lake to purchase a few zero-emission maintenance vehicles for their maintenance department. One is from the city of Fortuna to install vehicle charging stations at their corporation yard. And then HTA made a request under 2 projects. One is their service bay project, which is for their hydrogen bus transitions. And the other is for supplemental budget for their liquid hydrogen fueling station, which of course right now they're operating under a temporary hydrogen fueling station type regime. So with that, it's about $1.4 million in requests for about $1 million worth of funding. So this was taken to the TAC at the June 5th meeting, ultimately to receive a recommendation and to promote a discussion at the TAC level for a recommendation for which projects to fund. And I'll note pretty quickly, as part of the TAC meeting, the whole group came to consensus that the approach that they recommended putting forward was funding all of the smaller agency projects, or all of the agency projects in full, and that HTA would be the recipient of the remainder of the funding, which would go to augment the existing projects they have. I'll note that as part of that effort, staff did do a preliminary review of the projects and determined that they were eligible, or we believe that they are eligible in the program. And all of those projects are thought to have a pretty expeditious NEPA timeline, environmental compliance for the federal government, which is important because NEPA coverage is required before the funds can be obligated. So a project that had a really long NEPA compliance pathway, say you had to do an environmental impact study over several years, could significantly jeopardize actually being able to program that funding. So with that, the tax recommendation is again to fund the local agency projects in full, and that the remaining funding go to Humboldt Transit Authority. So a few other items were discussed in addition to that, and one is, what's a little bit interesting about this program is after you have received approval from your governing body to program the funding, that's when you submit the form to Caltrans, ultimately to determine eligibility for a project. So there is a small chance that any one of these projects, after submitted to Caltrans, could be sent back saying that it's not quite in line with the carbon reduction strategy as stated. And I will note the guidelines right now, while relatively comprehensive, leave some room for interpretation for a few of the projects that are proposed. So with that, and with the idea of getting approvals from the board and from the TAC to quickly program the money should circumstances change, what staff and the TAC are also recommending is that if for some reason what is approved here this evening comes back differently from Department of Transportation insofar as what projects may or may not be eligible, that a receiving agency, say the City of Arcata, City of Fortuna, City of Blue Lake, HTA, could propose an alternate project that meets the guidelines within a relatively short period of time, and that we could work to program that same amount of funding, subject, nobody else would lose funding as part of that approach. And if a local agency wasn't ultimately able to adapt or to think of another project or to put something forward in that timeline, the strategy after that would be to allocate any overage funding to HTA's projects, which of course could accept as much as the carbon reduction program was able to offer. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll end with the recommendation at this level, which is that the board consider adopting the tax recommendation and to allow the executive director to fill and complete all the necessary documentation and the latitude to work with local agencies for adjustments to projects in the need to program the money as quickly as possible should that circumstance arise. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that report. Let it be known that Board Member Orr has arrived and is present at our meeting now. Thank you. And so with that, are there any questions on the staff report from board members? Seeing none, go ahead. Board Member Burgell.
I'm just curious, at the end of the report for HCA, it does say that any remaining funds will be going to support the Earth project. Do we anticipate any funds being? So, let me see if I can, okay, so in the report about HTA, it does say that there may be remaining funds available and that those would go to support the Earth Center. Do we anticipate any funding being left over to do that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that the Earth Center piece is in there. The two projects that HTA did submit for support from this program were the service bay project, which is retrofitting their existing
Right.
mechanic service bays for hydrogen buses, because they need different equipment in there ultimately to work on it. And then the other one being their permanent hydrogen fueling station.
Sure.
So they would get the excess after the other projects were funded.
Right.
And in the contingency, if one of the other projects is deemed ineligible by DOT and they weren't interested in pursuing quickly another project to do, that would ultimately fall back to those same two HTA projects. So the service bay and or the hydrogen fueling station.
Okay, so we don't anticipate any money going toward the Earth Center.
Correct.
Great.
Great clarification, because it's certainly there at the end of the page, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Where
It
is
certainly is,
It's
yeah.
on the very last page.
It's the very
under
last
HTA.
paragraph of the report of PHT. It says, if there are remaining grant funds after the completion of the project, HTA could either return remaining CRP funds or could apply the remaining funds to the Earth Center project to support the success of that project. So I was curious if there was any anticipation of funding that might be going towards the Earth Center.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's an oversight on our part, and that's not part of their funding request by all means.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we know how HTA feels about this recommendation at this point?
The current TAC chair is an HTA seat, and it was they were very active in the discussion at the TAC level, and it was their initial position to recognize that the other agencies' projects were important too. So they're fully aware and on board with the approach, and that's part of the tax recommendation.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions from board members? Seeing none, we'll go to public comment. And is there any comment on this item in the audience? None here locally, any online and Zoom? Seeing no hands there as well, we'll bring it back to the board for a consideration of a motion. And the motion was quite inclusive to give Brennan the room to be able to maneuver in a tight timeline, if I remember right. It had a number of little pieces, so ideally the motion would be to adopt that entire staff recommendation, but of course it's up to the board. Any motions?
I move that we accept staff recommendation.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion by Board Member Burgell and a second by Napier, and we'll go ahead and call a voice vote. And all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Okay. All right. So at this point, we're on item number 7, a discussion item, and that is the proposed approach to the Regional Climate Action Plan, or RCAP, committee and manager position for fiscal year 25-26. And again, we have a staff report.
Excellent. That'll be me again. And I do want to provide one point of clarification going back to the last item about the Earth Center. I do acknowledge that was in HTA's funding request, but given what came through, it was not part of their ultimate discussion at the TAC meeting and, of course, the recommendation that came forward. So the recommendation, as you see in the staff report and ultimately just made, is consistent with what would go forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Debbie, if you'll launch, I do have a brief presentation here that I would like to run through. If you go to share at the bottom. Excellent. So this is an item that that it has come before the board a couple of times in 2024. Once, I believe, in September, when County Planning Director John Ford came to present on the Regional Climate Action Plan, or RCAP, and then again in December when Ms. Burks, the previous executive director at HCOG, brought forward an initial plan or framework for consideration by the HCOG board as to how the climate action plan, and more specifically a climate program manager position that is a regional position that works on RCAP compliance across all of our jurisdictions, could be brought into HCOG. So this is a little bit of a follow-up to that item, and with that, I wanted to start out with hold for or pause for effect.
Pretty picture.
On the screen. There we go. With that, I want to provide a little bit of an overview of more specifically what I was hoping to discuss here this evening. So first, I wanted to review again the previous board direction or discussions that happened at the December 2024 meeting. And then I would like to move into that and discuss some, let's call them additional options for the board to consider for funding the climate manager position, in addition to envisioning what the climate committee and what that board oversight model would look like. Lastly, I want to present what staff anticipates would be the next steps, depending on how what direction staff receives from the board, and last, open it up to just open discussion and public comment and just get everybody's ideas. Of course, I would like to acknowledge that this is a discussion item, so the intent is really just to cycle through some more options and get everybody's opinion on this, and really get the board's where the board is on this item, and really help guide and direct staff as to how you envision us moving forward, working collaboratively to potentially bring this position to HCOG. So going back to December 2024, I want to do a little bit on the previous direction. So the recommendation brought forward at that time, which was concurred with by the board, would be to fund a climate program manager within the HCOG organizational chart for the first year using HCOG reserve funds. And then with that, the vision at that time for the climate committee, which is a term that is used repeatedly in the RCAP itself, would be formed by taking the HCOG board, which has all of the necessary memberships already as part of it, all 7 incorporated cities plus the county, and folding in a few more advisory members, very similar to the PAC. So the idea being that HTA is already an advisory member of our board meetings, and that membership from RCEA and HWMA, which are the 2 other JPAs of interest in the RCAP, could be brought in to ultimately form an advisory board level climate committee. And lastly, the understanding at that time, and part of the reason this process was brought forward with as much urgency and as expeditiously as it was the thought was that the RCAP would be fully adopted and ready to be implemented as early as the spring, so a couple of months' time, and also recognizing there was a transition in the executive director position. So the potential need to get a system and a framework going and going quickly was certainly on the minds of staff at that time. So with that, of course, I'm a new employee here, and there's just new, let's say, perspectives or opportunities or areas of interest that I think are worth exploring. And with that, I think that talking about a few additional alternatives, may be warranted. And one of the initial reasons that really jumped out to me was I think we have more time. In discussions with county planning division staff, they're really not foreseeing the RCAP being taken through the Planning Commission and through the Board of Supervisors, really more in the June, July, August area, and potentially into September. So right now, Director Ford with Humboldt County is thinking that it'll be more like September when the RCAP is adopted by the county and ready for implementation. And to that note, this is a multi-jurisdictional plan that's happening right now. So even when it's completed by staff, adopted by all the county boards and bodies, it's then going to go to each local agency for consideration for adoption and approval after that. So it's very likely that the plan won't be fully adopted by all of the partner agencies until the end of 2025, which isn't a ton of time, but there's certainly some time to really be thoughtful and think about all these, kind of hard little steps on the front end of bringing on a manager position as opposed to after a position is formed. So another follow-up item I wanted to touch on is funding for the position. So especially since this item was last discussed in December, there are a number of moving parts that have made it more difficult potentially to justify or to want to use HCOG reserve funds to float the position for a year. And the first one I'll note is, of course, the state budget, like many of our local budgets, is in a deficit, and they're projecting a deficit, and they're looking for areas to dial back funding commitments. And with that, grant opportunities for this type of work in the coming years may be significantly less likely to be obtained. And I know an initial part of the approach would have been to fund with reserves and then to apply aggressively for grants to continue the manager position into the future. Unfortunately, it just, a year ago, 18 months ago, that would have seemed like a pretty surefire way or a high success rate in order to be able to fund the position. Right now, we're not so certain that that's going to be a pathway that would provide a high level of certainty or success. Fold into that the federal government's directives as it regards specifically this type of work and these types of grant programs. We don't anticipate there being any many, if at all, funding programs that would be eligible through the federal government. Lastly, as it pertains to HCOG reserves, we're a little hesitant to necessarily move forward fully funding a position that is probably about 50% non-transportation related with full transportation dollars if we don't have to. And I think it's important that with that, if HCOG through this position is going to take on responsibilities in the management position or the climate program manager position that includes working in areas like building electrification and solid waste and water and wastewater and carbon sequestration, that we are receiving funding participation from those types of eligible funds, not just transportation dollars. And to go back a little bit to the state and federal budget area too, with the previous executive director, and I hope to continue it going forward, we do have a lot of grant projects that we are leading right now regionally, and a lot of them are state and federally funded and require HCOG to, I'll say, float the cost quarter to quarter before reimbursements. And right now, through our discussions with some Caltrans staff and through, honestly, staff's experience trying to work with the Federal Department of Transportation, we're not really receiving a high level responsiveness, if anything, from the federal DOT. And I'm concerned that we're going to have to float some of those costs for projects and reimbursements longer with our federal grants. And of course, as we're floating costs, that comes from our reserves. So we're potentially going to have to exercise that reserve amount more notably in the coming years if if the staffing is going to remain as low as it is, and if the responsiveness on processing the paperwork is going to be that slow. So that's from the funding area. And then lastly, as it pertains to the committee or the board structure, you know, in really kind of reviewing and thinking about some options and looking at some, you know, what some other agencies and other areas are doing as it comes to climate work, the RCAP is really big. You know, transportation is a very large component of it, but so is building electrification and energy policy. So is Senate Bill 1383, which is the solid waste and organics recycling directive from the state as well. And so is water, wastewater, and carbon sequestration issues too. So with that, we really just wanted to think about board structures that could offer more ability to bring more expertise, let's say, into the realm, into the decision making, into participating in RCAP compliance, and ultimately how can we potentially build a framework that would be more supportive for the climate manager position as well. So I want to start with the funding, a proposed alternative to the funding approach. And again, the previous one would have been to have HCOG float that cost for a year. I would like to move forward with entertaining the proposal that if we have 5 to 7 months right now before the RCAP is fully adopted, staff's current recommendation would be to have discussions with local agencies on a regional funding approach that assumes that we are unsuccessful in obtaining grant funding. Taking this approach, speaking with local agency staff, developing a plan using local funds to be able to fund the climate manager position. And local funds not only could include local agency dollars, but it could still include contributions from JPAs like HCOG or HTA, RCA, or HWMA. But having the discussions now, building an MOU framework now, building a funding approach now that had an agreed upon term, ultimately is going to provide a level of certainty and stability to the position, to the program, to the implementation of the RCAP in general. And it's also going to provide an opportunity to engage with all of our local agency partners and really understand where they're at, where their participation level is, where they're thinking as far as dedicating their own staff resources to implementation areas of the plan. Lastly, if we have those conversations now, it really dovetails quite well into the potential to bring those funding agreements or funding MOUs to their boards and councils when the RCAP ultimately comes before them for approval and adoption by the local agency staff. So, you know, it's work that probably would have been done certainly in the absence of grant funding before. It's just really bringing this more forward to before the position is filled and trying to build that buy-in from the member agencies and that funding certainty for the program manager and the implementation of the RCAP itself before we end up, you know, handing the reins over to somebody or an organization in order to do this work. Go ahead one more time. Next, we'll go to some climate committee alternatives that I have some kind of organizational charts here just to kind of help, you know, be a visual guidance for what staff is thinking about right now. So the first alternative is we'll call it the PAC model. So that's the original alternative that was discussed and recommended in December. The next being what I've kind of termed through the staff report, the TAC model, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the best name for it, and we'll see why here in a minute. And of course, I want to end here by saying other alternatives because this is a discussion. What we want to do is come forward with what we think is the best alternative that serves the most people that are, you know, bought into the climate action plan in general. And so maybe neither of these is the best alternative, and that alternative is yet to be found through the process. So the first here is the PAC model. Again, this is what was discussed in December, with the idea being that HCOG could take on a climate program manager. That manager could report to the executive director. Ultimately, we all report to the HCOG board, and the HCOG board could convene, as you see in green, what we could call a regional climate advisory committee. So that could include membership from HTA, in addition to membership from HWMA and RCEA. That the HCOG board can reconvene and ultimately vote on recommendations from that advisory committee, just like they do with the PAC now. One of the limitations, and part of what spurred my discussion to think, or thought to think about this a little bit more, was again, a lot of the compliance measures in the Regional Climate Action Plan are non-transportation related. There's a very heavy element of building energy and energy policy and electrification. There's actually a pretty healthy amount of solid waste, again, with SB 1383. And then there's some areas that the local agencies work heavy in, like water and wastewater and carbon sequestration. So with that, the HCOG board would be asked more to serve in the area of making recommendations, for providing approvals for policy and work areas that were outside of what HCOG usually works in, which is transportation. And in this model, including only one representative on that advisory committee from RCEA or HWMA or HTA could potentially underrepresent their expertise and maybe the amount of oversight they should have in those particular areas of work. Of course, I think this was mentioned too. This model still could be, call it, expanded or augmented by having what I've shown here to the left, which is kind of a climate regional technical advisory committee. Again, this could be a staff level committee similar to HCOG's HCOG's technical advisory committee. So that could be kind of the staff level technical resource that helps provide an additional level of advisory role and oversight to the climate manager position, and also ultimately to the HCOG board. So this is the other potential framework that, through some thought internally as staff and through discussion with some local agency staff, that we've also come up with as an alternative to consider. And that's the idea that we've called the TAC model, but that's a little bit misleading because ultimately the authority, the decision making, the approvals, and ultimately ensuring compliance with the RCAP would come down to the board. You know, the boards at all of our JPAs and at our member agencies are the ones that are in charge of, you know, making sure that we as staff are ultimately moving forward in the direction, you know, as approved and as deemed appropriate by the RCAP or any of the compliance areas that we're working in. So the idea under this model would be to convene a regional climate action advisory committee at the staff level, similar to the TAC. And this could function as an advisory and oversight level committee, and really kind of like a working group, I'll say, for the climate manager position. And they could help to, you know, develop a lot of the goals. If you read the RCAP, there's a lot of sentences in there like the program manager and the climate committee will work with RCEA or facilitate this or work with HWMA. And the way a lot of it reads, it kind of lends itself to thinking about it more as a working group staff level type system. That being said, under this model, I think there's a framework for which the climate program manager, which answers to the climate committee, the staff level committee, would ultimately answer to each and every one of the boards that is part of our regional JPA structure, if you will. So the climate program manager would have to present and seek approvals from the HCOG board on transportation related items, would have to seek and gain approvals from HTA on transit specific items, or, you know, HTA and the HCOG board could be somewhat blended together, I suppose, because we are in some ways. But the climate manager would also, you know, work with and seek approvals from the RCEA board in items that were pertinent to building energy or electrical policy, and similarly with the HWMA board. So the idea here again is to maybe have the climate program manager be working with and ultimately responsible to all of our JPA boards as a means to better get more representation across the board, no pun intended, from all of the, you know, specialties that these JPAs are working in, because that's how the RCAP is written. It has all these multidisciplinary areas that are really important ultimately in pushing forward the goals and objectives of the RCAP. So with that, I do just have a couple of next steps here that we would move forward with, assuming that the board ultimately wants staff to explore these in more detail. So as it pertains to funding, the next step that we would do at the staff level is to work with our local agency and JPA partner staff to identify a funding strategy for the position. Once we developed a draft funding strategy, which would include some allocation amounts or some options or what ultimately the financial impact would be to any agency or any JPA, we would bring forward a draft memorandum of understanding that could be reviewed by local agencies and by the HCOG board and ultimately taken forward for approval, which would lock in the funding mechanism, which would allow HCOG to take on the climate action manager position. With that, we could move forward with developing, we would do this before the MOU, of course, but we'd develop a job description for the manager position. We'd develop a work plan, recognizing it's a brand new position and we'd want a new employee to be able to come in and hit the ground running with that. And then ultimately we'd move towards filling the position, of course. As it comes to the climate committee or the board structure, depending on the discussion here amongst the board this evening, we could move forward at the staff level with, again, working with our local agency and JPA partner staff to really refine an approach to a board/climate committee oversight type structure. And, part of that would probably be researching what some other JPA entities, what some other regional entities are doing in this type of work area or others, because, like everything, there's a lot of great examples out there for how we could maybe achieve or ultimately implement some sort of a joint powers authorities, so to speak. The other thing we would need to do, again, is work with legal counsel, because ultimately this would have to be brought forward with some legal framework and some agreements. So whatever we started to bring forward in a proposed fashion would need to be vetted from a legal perspective. And then lastly, with all that, we'd need to gain approval, of course, from local agencies and the HCOG board. So that is our anticipated next steps. And I'll end here with really specifically what staff at this point are looking for from the HCOG board to move forward. And that is what I call the obvious question number one, but it should be asked is, does the HCOG board still want staff to proceed with continuing to explore an RCAP position at HCOG? And if so, to continue to take what I would call a leadership role regionally in how that would look and how the funding would look and how the committee structure would look. Again, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but if just, of course, wanted to ask again what I would ask or say is the obvious question. Number two, staff would like to know if the board would like to move forward with modifying the funding approach for the position, and if so, is the board open to exploring cost share options that could include cost share from our JPAs, and maybe more specifically, is the board of the mind that if we move forward with this, that the local agencies should explore funding the entirety of that position, or is the board open to exploring having an agency like HCOG or RCEA contribute regular ongoing funding towards the position to help offset costs to the local agencies themselves? Number three, staff would like to get some input from the board on the options for the climate committee and oversight structure, and ultimately get an idea on what the board wants staff to explore and ultimately bring back. Again, this is a discussion item. All these things will come back multiple times before ultimately something is recommended and certainly approved. And then lastly, of course, should staff consider any other options in that regard or any other direction you may have to staff at this time. So with that, I'll cede the floor. I know this has been long and a lot of information, but I do appreciate your attention and your patience and look forward to the discussion as well.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And I assume at some point we're going to want to put that list back up again for the board to be able to follow along. But
That was my thought too.
sure,
Leave the list
yeah, there's a lot here, but you've laid it out really nicely, Brendan. Thank you. And staff, Amy, thank you very much. So if I understand correctly, we're not looking for any final decisions tonight. What you're looking for is direction from this board in regards to the discussion elements you've put forward and the various options that includes. So at this point, I'd like to ask the board if there are any clarifying questions on what we're doing tonight and what was presented. And then I want to go out to public comment and then hear from the public and then come back for discussion by the board and ultimately some direction. Does that sound about right?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Any clarifying questions from the board? Yes.
Well, I guess relative to question number one, my first thought is just on a hypothetical level, and I wasn't on the COG when this all got going last year or whatever it was, but is there a viable option? I mean, what would happen if HCOG just stepped back and said, well, we're not going to take a leadership role in this. Would it then fall to the county to figure out how to move that plan forward, or?
I think, yes, that's kind of the assumption. And in some ways, that's how the RCAP is currently written for it to fall on the county. I think that there's certainly some drawbacks to that. And HCOG, by all means, is certainly a logical place, as logical as any, to house that position and to house that compliance area. But, the two options outside of that would be to have somebody else, some other agency or some other JPA take that leadership role, or for local agencies collectively to decide that they were going to take on that compliance work themselves. So those would be the options outside of HCOG, again, taking the lead in that area.
Okay. And as far as, like, for example, cities taking a share of the cost to fund the position, would they essentially be then giving back some of the transportation monies that we receive through HCOG, or would that be like general fund expenditure?
The individual budgeting decisions would need to be brought forward by the local agency doing the funding. What I will say is it's likely that the types of transportation funds that they receive right now have certain restrictions on them. Just thinking about things like LTF or other funding sources that come through HCOG to local agencies. There's certain ones that they wouldn't be able to touch, of course, or things like enterprise fund for water and sewer. So I guess I won't say answer your question because I don't 100% know. It's probably very likely that something like general fund or something that is fully unrestricted is what a local agency would have to identify in order to be able to move forward with that cost share.
You can't think of any transportation funds that could just be given back to help fund the position.
That's a sticky area because there are some that come through that are very specific to performing like pavement maintenance, like RSTP, which was on the consent calendar this evening. There is LTF funding, which comes through, and so long as you go through the motions, there are some eligible uses that could be put forward in there. The one thing I will note from a local agency perspective is the LTF and TDA in general as a funding source is not increasing at the same rate as inflation across all the areas in which it's spent, which is construction and staffing costs and transit costs and things like that. So local agencies aren't universally anymore readily able to repurpose LTF funding for any other thing at this point. That's what we're seeing anyway in working with our partners. And I will say, outside of my role here as the executive director, that's what I experienced in my final time as a public works director of a local agency.
Okay. Well, it certainly seems like you picked a good time to step back and sort of reevaluate the landscape that's ahead of us here. So I'm glad we're having the discussion.
Yeah, and the other thing I would like to note is, a lot of this discussion is not new. These are items that the board discussed in some level of detail or were presented by Director Burks at that time. But the idea really was these are some things we could explore once we get up and moving. And I think maybe more so the change in approach is less that this is all novel and it has been outside of the realm of discussions as it has developed to this point, but just that we have them now and not after we have a position online, after we have a plan approved. I think there's time for us to work together and to ultimately come to agreements on how we're going to do this before we get something online and worked through. So
Great. Thanks for those clarifying questions. Those were quite timely. Anybody else on the board that has any clarifying questions? Yes.
I just have a couple. When considering this, I think that the point that you made was a good one when you spoke about wastewater, waste management, those types of things that are really not in our purview. So I hear that. And I'm curious about, so the clarification would be, would this be something, say HCOG did not take this, would this be something then that we would be creating perhaps a new JPA with a member from HCOG, or HWMA and all the things? Is that kind of the direction you're discussing here? or
No.
considering?
No, I think if I was at staff level and at discussions with local agency staff, the thing we all are kind of recognizing is that the RCAP is almost this playing field that includes participations from a bunch of boards or agencies or JPAs that already exist, right? We have a lot of transportation related nexus that we do here at HCOG. RCEA has a lot of overlap with their energy policy, HWMA, the local agencies, so on and so forth. So I think the idea here is, could we find a way, an elegant way, where HCOG could house the position and receive the funding from local agencies and ultimately be the staff level implementer, but then to use our other JPAs and boards as the oversight structure across the entirety of the RCAP, if that makes sense. And rather than trying to build the board approval structure within one within one JPA, such as HCOG, that we could use like a collective of multiple boards or an agreement among multiple boards to say, hey, if the RCAP manager is working in an area that is about microgrids, that's an approval structure that would be more likely to go through the RCEA board. Or if the climate manager was working on a grant for zero emission fleet transition, that's a great approval area for the HCOG board to take on. So again, the idea being, how do we leverage more of our JPA and board partnerships where there's more staff and more expertise working in all of these other areas that are pertinent to the RCAP too? Because again, all the transportation could be considered the biggest of all of the areas of the RCAP. As far as the implementation measures themselves, they don't total quite 50%. So there's still a lot of other work areas to be explored and to be guided by a board's direction, let's say.
So then if I may.
Go ahead, please.
So then would the manager he would have to report to different boards and they would be responsible for their sections. Is that what I'm hearing? I'm trying to understand, because if
Yeah.
we're all under the same umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
but say that they bring some wastewater to HCOG, it seems like that would be better handled somewhere else.
Yes, and I agree with that, and that's kind of what spurred the thought of this to be something to explore, is that, again, the manager would be expected to work across all of our local agency jurisdictions and across a broad spectrum of types of work. And with that end, there's going to be a more appropriate board or audience to direct those decisions to. And if there was a way to collectively designate various boards that worked across multiple disciplines that would have oversight ability for portions of the RCAP, and therefore the climate manager would report to, ultimately certain boards or certain areas to get, again, seek approvals for a contract or, reporting in a certain area or moving forward a zoning ordinance in a certain area of legislation or regulation. That may be a more appropriate fit. And then again, that way, we wouldn't be asking for just a single voting member from a board to participate in the HCOG board meetings as an advisory member, when again, maybe we only have one RCEA representative in here for an item that is entirely energy policy.
So similarly then, potentially, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
suss this out. It could work similar to, for instance, the planning commission and the different commissions that we have in our agencies. Each commission either, agrees or doesn't agree, and then that comes back and we look at that when we're looking at an item. So is that kind of more the direction you're thinking? I'm just,
Yeah. Something
I don't
like
want to get in
that.
the weeds. I'm just
No, totally. But the
to
weeds are where we need to get,
trying to
quite
understand,
frankly,
yeah.
because it is big and it is daunting in some ways, and it's very multidisciplinary. And I think the important thing is, so the climate action plan itself references, again, a climate committee. And the climate committee realistically is just some body that works to develop and focus implementation of the goals of the RCAP. That committee could be a staff level thing that ultimately has oversight from all these various boards, and we could figure out how to structure that relationship if there's a hierarchy or if it's kind of a flat organizational structure and how all of the boards sit relative to each other insofar as approvals. There's a lot of detail that would have to be worked out in that, and again, getting the thoughts or the direction of the board at this time would be helpful, because then we can start to really explore what some of those options are. And even the two scenarios that were brought forward for consideration here in this PowerPoint, it's not necessarily a certainty that we could do that or that makes sense or that's what everybody's going to want in the end, but it'll help kind of guide the approach that we ultimately collectively develop and bring back for a recommendation at one time. But again, my initial thought with this, staff's initial thought with this is, how do we develop a technical level advisory committee that can provide as much of a peer working group and support to the manager position, which is also going to get more regular participation from all the local agencies who, quite frankly, are the ones implementing the RCAP and are subject to the requirements of the RCAP. That's not HCOG, that's not RCEA, that's not HTA. Those are the local agencies. And with that, how can we leverage as many of those JPA and local agency boards to help guide the work and to make sure that, we have the right tool for the job, so to speak, the right board, the right expertise ultimately that's looking at a particular recommendation or trying to advance the goals of the RCAP. So I hope that somewhat answered your question. It's maybe not super satisfying at this point because it's all very big picture, but.
Great. Thank you. So I will say, as was mentioned earlier, I think the timing is perfect for you to bring in these questions forward, especially because there's some delays in getting the RCAP approved anyway. We've got the time. And so if we don't have the buy-in of all of our member agencies, I don't know how we're going to implement the plan, right? And so the more buy-in there is up front in the structure and how it's going to work, number one, we're sharing the cost of doing it, but it also speaks strongly towards participation in implementing it, which ultimately is going to come down to coming up with as many incentives as possible to accomplish, meeting these goals rather than just regulatory hammers, right? So the more positive financial incentives there are brought forward to the various cities, the county, and everything else, the more likely we're going to implement a whole lot of this plan. And so there's a lot of work to do in that arena, frankly. And some of that's been embedded in the plan at our board. I know we spoke to that quite a bit. So timing, I think, is perfect. Wastewater and water, LAFCO, that's a whole nother entity that represents all the various communities, and that's their purview, really, is what's going on with their municipal service reviews and where are we heading with those things and how do those things fit into climate adaptation and other kinds of things. Is it consolidation or is it staying, rural? I don't know, but LAFCO is definitely embedded in that topic, that area of discussion as well. So with that, if there are no further, I want to ask if any of the PAC members want to also provide any input.
One of the things I was thinking about with your discussion is that possibly this should be almost like a TAC committee, and that all the JPAs that we all belong to, someone in their staff would be designated to be part of it. We're in the city of Arcata. We're involved in climate change. We're looking at what we can do and how we can change things. I'm assuming that many of your cities are doing exactly the same thing that we are, or are wanting to, and maybe you aren't wherever. But I was also thinking about the Air Quality Control Board, and if they would have any space within this to be a part of it. I do serve on that, so that's one of the reasons I'm bringing it up as the city representative. And it does have 3 counties involved, and I don't know what those other counties are actually thinking about, but maybe it should be a bigger situation than just Humboldt County, because we know the other counties are going to definitely affect what's going on here. And so that is one of my thoughts. even though I'm not the alternate for HCOG.
You're
and
representing.
Stacy was unable to come today,
Yeah.
but just from the city's perspective. And I also think about that maybe there is a way that the cities, I have no idea thinking about this budgetarily, but maybe the cities can all figure out how to kick something in to the system. And so it doesn't all come out of the HCOG funding. And I know as far as Humboldt Transit Authority is concerned, we really count on some of that funding in order to do what we need to do for transportation. And I think that HTA is making a big dent in the system. I guess when I have a chance to speak as Humboldt Transit Authority, unless I have it now, do I or not?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
you're
you. I just think about
PAC
what
member.
we've been able to do with the hydrogen buses. We know we're going to have 125,000 less polluting into the air. We're going to be cleaner in the streets and so forth. We have 15 more buses that are planned on coming. And so the funding for the hydrogen station is really important because right now it's temporary, but it's working. And they took the hydrogen bus and they really stressed it out to see what it would be able to accomplish or not accomplish. So they loaded it with all these barrels of water and they put heaters on it. The driver and Peter Lehman, who is part of the whole SHOTS lab and part of this whole hydrogen bus system, said it was so hot in there they could hardly stand it, but they wanted to push it as hard as they could to see what would happen if they went up to Willow Creek, if they went down to Ukiah, how would it perform? So it was not supposed to perform at the level it is. It's actually getting 425 miles where they expected it to be around 380 something or other. So it's really going to perform much better, and we're looking forward to that going into the North Transit, the new bus system that'll be connecting Reading, going down to Mendocino, Sonoma, San Francisco eventually. Because right now we do run down to Ukiah, and it costs you about $3 or $2 or $3 to ride the bus down there at the moment. So I feel like we've made a lot of progress, and they worked really hard on these hydrogen buses to make sure they're going to function well. They went back and checked them out a number of times with the company that's producing them. So I think, that's where we sort of stand on that. And I think that's going to really help with the whole climate change that we're talking about, and that it's one of the aspects. And that's why it's important for us to be able to get the funding, you call it local transportation funds, because HTA uses them really well. And we're going to be, we're taking, as you know, we're taking on Dollar Ride. And that we were working on that as a component, but now we brought it in-house. And so we hope we'll be able to, hiring drivers for it, and we hope it'll be more efficient since we've been operating a certain part of it, but not the whole show.
Great.
And I think we have a really good staff for HTA. They're doing clever work, good work,
Great.
working really hard to make things work.
Well, you've accomplished two goals. You've given us input on this agenda item, and you've also given us an update on HTA as well. We appreciate that.
I was hoping that I didn't know.
That's okay. That's okay. It fit fine. I will say I really appreciate you bringing up the Air Quality Resources Control Board. We're getting ready to cut the ribbon on the Bay Trail. Everybody can see the pavings going down. The last section is happening this week. And that project started with a Air Quality Resources Control Board grant 33 years ago, when I and Jen Rice identified a grant from the Air Quality Board that said, do you have any ideas on how to reduce emissions? And we said, yeah, a trail around the bay. And we put together 7 alternatives for that trail that then eventually led to many more studies. And now here we have a completion of a trail 33 years later, right? That's what it takes, as we all know in our jobs. It's not something that happens overnight. But yeah, they're an important player as well, because, emissions is a big part of climate, and carbon sequestration is one of those tools. It helps with, air emissions and sequestration and all these other things. So all of these are important. So thanks for bringing that up, Alex. Appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. So please.
On that same note, I wondered if maybe Caltrans had a place in the committee as well, our climate branch. I know that these details could be figured out later, but just wanted to make sure that was brought up.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you. You guys do transportation?
Well, if I can, you're Caltrans, I know, but if I can just say this, Caltrans has put together a different committee now, and they've been coming to the HTA meetings, and they're really interested in the kind of providing transportation that will help out the climate, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And so we usually always have one or maybe two people from Caltrans now.
That's great.
And Saskia Burnett is one of our representatives, or one of your representatives from Caltrans, has been coming on a regular basis to HTA, and she's a planner.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any final clarifying questions before we go to public comment?
If I
Yes,
may
please,
just
Brandon.
jump in to expand on
Yeah.
the comment from our PAC members as well. I think one of the areas in which, if again, we very well recognize that the board oversight and the board membership is going to be there in one way, shape, or form. So do we consolidate it in the HCOG sphere, so to speak, or do we try to find ways to leverage more boards? That's really some of the discussion I'm trying to spur in that area. As it pertains to convening a technical advisory committee, if you will, as it is more a staff level position, that committee and how that interacts on the staff level with the program manager is a perfect setting to include Caltrans agency staff, to include tribal representation, to include HTA, RCEA, HWMA, all the various entities and agencies that have staff working in that area and that have, we'll say, skin in the game, so to speak, as it pertains to climate change and RCAP implementation.
Great. Thank you for that, Brandon.
And that is essentially your model number one that you presented, or the first.
It's number 2, I think. But
I would say in either scenario, staff's recommendation would be to have a technical level committee, whether the board decisions ended up only in the HCOG board or whether we found a way to include more boards or more JPAs that the climate manager would ultimately answer to or to provide recommendations for. That technical committee could exist in either.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go to public comment, and then we're going to come back and have you pull up a couple of those slides that help us get back to the options as well as the questions that were being asked of us. So at this point, public comment, please. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Melody Meyer, and I'm a member of ROCKR, which is the Redwood Coalition on Climate and Environmental Responsibility. My comment is about the committee structure discussion. ROCKR respectfully asks that the PAC support the original vision of establishing the board-level decision-making climate committee, or the PAC model, as staff has discussed. Taking a leadership role in regional climate action would be a really great step for HCOG, and it marks a substantial shift in its responsibilities. And so given the importance of this role, we believe it's essential that climate policy and strategy directly come from HCOG's board with active participation from a lot of the agencies that have been referenced, like RCEA, HTA, and the Waste Management Agency. A board level committee would continue to benefit from staff recommendations and expertise, but it would also ensure that elected and appointed leaders are directly involved in shaping HCOG's climate initiatives. I think fracturing that decision making to other agencies under one of the models that staff presented would result in the loss of this bigger picture that the RCAP is trying to accomplish and the larger goals in implementing RCAP. And I also believe that the PAC model would perhaps allow the program managers some more space to do research and do that hard work of translating it for the public and for the board. And I don't want any of that to be lost in whatever structure is ultimately decided on. But yes, thank you for your consideration and for all your work on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And we'll go to Zoom, being nobody else here in the room. Anybody on Zoom that would like to make public comment on this agenda item? Seeing no hands going up, we'll bring it back to the board. And Brandon, I think it's might be good. You had two, I mean, all the slides were great, but there are two in particular. One was the different models, I think, and then the other was the questions. Does that sound like a good way to approach this?
Yeah,
revisit that model one first, and then get to those questions. Yeah. Some sort of a logical approach to what is a very big question.
Baby steps.
Yeah.
Yep. gotta lay it out. Yeah, we'll bring those right up, and that sounds great.
While we're waiting for that, Brandon, can I ask, do you have any comments on the email sent in by the 350 Humboldt group?
Yeah, that's
did you
public comment. Thank you.
get a look at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say is I appreciate that we're, getting involvement, we're getting feedback from the public on this process, because ultimately I would consider us at the infant stages of deciding ultimately, what the board thinks and what more broadly the region thinks about bringing this policy and bringing the RCAP online collectively. What I will say as a clarifying point is, again, I think in some ways calling it a board level committee or a staff level committee, some of those things could be somewhat misleading, because I think there is a board component and a staff component in any way that we choose to approach this. There's going to be a staff level manager. I think there absolutely needs to be technical level representation from every local agency, from other partnering agencies, as we've discussed, in addition to the JPAs. Really, in my mind, the question comes down to is how broad do we want that board governance to be? Or when I say we, how does the HCOG board, how does the region and all their boards and committees, how do they want that implementation to look? And that reporting and ultimately, the accountability structure to look, I should say. So I appreciate their comments. I will say there was a second one that was provided by 360 Humboldt, which had provided a recommendation that included kind of what seemed to be kind of a joint powers authority, which I think in some ways is consistent with the option 2, where we find ways to bring more of that other JPA membership into voting membership, as opposed to an advisory board level membership, ultimately leaving the climate area with the HCOG board. And also recognizing if the HCOG board was to take fully the role as the voting member for all climate-related policy, we received a public comment a minute ago where, the acknowledgement that would be a pretty big shift overall in one of the major responsibilities that the HCOG board would be asked to do. And by no means is that right, wrong, or otherwise, just that would be doing that would result in kind of a paradigm shift as to what we would call the charge or business as usual as HCOG. So not that that's in any way a bad thing. It's just something that needs to be considered and not taken lightly in how we move forward with, making these decisions.
So is it fair to say that whatever we do here tonight is not set in stone? That there's going to be a lot of research being done by staff along with member agencies, as listed there, but also all our participating cities and other jurisdictions. And out of that, we'll suss out what we think are the elements of how to move forward. And that could very well, even though we might say, yeah, we like this model here tonight, you go into that process and you work with all the agencies, and we might very well end up at the other place. So I just want to be clear. I mean, we're not setting anything in stone tonight here per se, but we're trying to give you direction so you're not spinning your wheels, so you know where this board is feeling about this overall effort.
Yeah, I mean, consider this a temperature check.
Yeah.
We're really, we want to understand and to really start asking some of those tough questions, because you know how it goes sometimes when you sit down with an initial idea and, we say, oh, this sounds great, but then the next morning you show up and you start to put everything into little pieces as to how you'd approach it or how you'd figure it out. And there's a lot of questions that arise with that. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity to, in a higher level of detail, kick off the discussion, which ultimately is going to be helpful as we continue to engage with all of our local agency partners and JPAs, of which there are many. And, to your point, Chair Madrone, this is going to continue to come back. I will also note, of course, there's two, key members of this board that aren't here today as part of that discussion. And, I think everybody would like to have them ultimately participate as this shapes forward too. So staff's vision is this is going to come back, but this provides some initial thoughts from the board on what you see as an idea to explore, maybe more than the other, or to help guide it, recognizing that, like I said, we may have 5, 6, 7 months to get this done, which is just enough time, I think, to do it correctly and to go through all the motions and really be thorough before we kind of jump in.
Yeah.
But it's not so much time that we really want to be spinning our wheels or maybe bringing forward recommendations, that the board could have provided some alternate direction on early in the process. So.
Well, I do think it weighs heavily your introductory comments earlier about the state budget, the federal budgets, the clawbacks, the fact that this initial position would come out of our reserve account when really only 50% of all this is transportation. So there's a lot of reasons there to want to engage our member agencies and figure out how do we do this together right now, not later. So I really appreciate you taking a step back and asking these questions, staff, and thinking this through. So we've had public comment, and here's one of the charts, and the other one is the TAC model, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So this is the PAC model, again, where the advisory committee would live here in this room, so to speak, and include some additional membership.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then go to the TAC model, please. And there it is. And that just brings off to the side the advisory committee to get into more detail level stuff and feed that back into the system, basically.
Correct. And then to potentially have more boards participate in direction, visioning, and decision-making as it pertains to RCAP implementation.
And do you want this board to kind of tell you how we feel about these two models, or go to those questions as a way to answer where you want to go?
I think that the one of the questions, speaks specifically to this. And I think even if the board, an answer that is very, is very okay, so to speak, to come out of this discussion is, well, we just need more information and ultimately to make an informed decision on this. And if that's the direction of the area, that's fine too. Ultimately what we want to do is just bring forward some options and have some discussions, because the last thing we want to do is necessarily focus on one and miss an opportunity to really think it through in a thorough way. So, we could absolutely keep on here, or I'm happy to answer any questions, that the board may have as it pertains to these two. But, just general direction to say, explore them all, or explore if there was a one versus the other or any other ideas, that would be fine too. Again, I just really want to be very open in this process. I want to be inclusive and collaborative with all of you as board members, with the public, with the member agencies, again, who are ultimately the ones signing on to the implementation measures and carrying those through. I think it's important that everybody has a seat at the table and into how that looks. So
Thank you. Board Member Kenny, I think you. Yeah.
Well, would this model be analogous to what we have now with our TAC committee, and then where the board convenes as the PAC, and then we recommend things to ourselves to adopt? Would that be essentially what this chart shows, or would it be the first chart, or does it make a difference?
that would be the first chart. The first chart where basically all recommendations and work was worked out on the staff level or in the technical advisory committee level, if you will. But then as it comes to approvals and adoptions and really directioning, that would all fall on this board and any inclusive membership that was brought forward in another advisory committee, a board level advisory committee.
So the board would make the final decision.
Correct. I mean, at least that's kind of how it's envisioned, and that's why it's called the PAC model, because of course the PAC is the advisory committee to the HCOG board itself.
Doesn't the board make the final decision in either model?
Yes, the HCOG board would make the final decision in either model. The difference in this being that there may be the potential to, depending on the area of expertise that the climate program manager was working in, take that to the approving body that is appropriate for the type of work being completed.
Gotcha. Great. Okay.
Well, I guess for my part, I feel, I support the idea of holding off on committing our reserves to the first year salary for the position and seeing if we can explore another option that allows the position to exist and structure the funding in a way that preserves more of our reserve funds.
So in a way, that gets us to question number one on that list, if I remember correctly, if we might want to go to that. But I appreciate you bringing that point up of, are we willing to commit our reserves or not? And just a quick straw poll of the board, how do people feel about holding back on that as compared to where we were at earlier this year where we were going to commit that? Does the board feel good about holding back on that reserve approach at this time? Mr. Jorgensen, please.
Well, that was 200,000 set aside. And at the time, we had an unrestricted reserve of 600, and now it's 650. Is it anticipated that a budget of 200 would cover the position for a year? I know there may not be an answer to that, but it's a question I've been thinking about. The money was set aside. I'd like to see it stay there.
Mm-hmm. Until we make a final decision. Yeah, good point. So not spend it now, but keep it in that position in case we are ready to move forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
In to that note, to make sure everybody is aware as well, so that is actually, that 200,000 is part of the approved overall work program and budget that will come active on July 1st. So even having these discussions, that original contingency absolutely exists. The budget is there, and we could move forward if there was, a compelling reason, be it timeline or anything else, to make that happen in a short term. And to answer your other question, we are confident that 200,000 would fund the position for a full year, the fully burdened rate for a position. I'm pretty confident with that, and yeah.
Great. Thank you for
the
that.
comment.
So to move us along, if that's okay with everybody, we're all on the same page here, so to speak. With these questions, the first one was, you can read it all there yourselves, but continue exploring RCAP work and taking some form of a leadership role in this. I thought if we just do a straw poll kind of a vote on each of these, then somebody could craft a motion to support whatever it is it looks like the board wants to do, if that works. So on the first question, does anybody have a problem with HCOG staff continuing to explore this? Seeing no.
I think that would be appropriate.
Yeah.
To keep exploring.
Yeah, I think it's better than the county, frankly. But hey, we'll be a big player, so
You would be in a position to know, I guess.
theoretically. Okay, number 2, modify the position funding approach, which is we're leaving the money on the table, as Board Member Jorgensen said, but we want to explore funding options like with the other partners and or other things. We know grants aren't going to, the money at the state and the feds are not really a big likely, but sitting down with our partners and figuring this out a little better, right? That's what that is, trying to look at that. Anybody in opposition
Well,
to that?
I guess the situation I'd be anxious to avoid would be spending the $200,000 and then come to find out that there's no money to continue it. So I would think that a program like this in the first full year would be a lot of getting things rolling and up to speed, and then have it suddenly cut off would be like we'd be
Silly.
thinking, well, I wish you would have held on to that $200,000 then. But no way of knowing, if that would happen, but that's the caution I'm expressing. And I think when the board approved the $200,000, the expectation was reasonable that the grant funding would be there to continue it. Not so much now.
Yeah.
So,
Well put. Okay. Any opposition to number 2? Seeing none. Number 3, what climate committee or oversight structure does the board want to explore? And that was sort of back to those 2 options, wasn't it? Right. And does anybody have any strong feelings about one of those options or another at this point? More information?
I have
Okay.
some, I believe to be simple questions which would help me. My time on our council, state or county representatives, the county planner came to our meeting and gave a presentation. I believe they did here too.
Mm-hmm.
What agency told us to develop an RCAP?
State.
I will speak to this part to the best of my ability, but I will caveat that by saying that the initial implementation of this lived heavily within the local agencies and within the county. So my understanding is that the RCAP is being brought forward by a pair or perhaps a trio of regulatory or legislative bills, both in the Senate and in the state assembly, which are tied back to the greenhouse gas emissions targets, which I believe were in AB 375 and AB 32. So these are the same assembly bills that have put forward a lot of the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled regulations, that are also being brought forward as well. And those are targets that were put on MPO areas. So my understanding is there's a framework that's being put in place with local agency areas or joint powers areas, such as our region here up in Humboldt, where it's not, my understanding is that our caps aren't necessarily a requirement or a regulatory mandate, say like your compliance for your wastewater discharge at a local agency, or SB 1383, the solid waste and organics composting recycling stuff. That is a mandate from the state being enforced through CalRecycle. I think this is more the approach of recommended best practices, and ultimately a region having an RCAP, a regional climate action plan, would help an agency or an area be competitive for discretionary and grant funding opportunities in the future, and that also will bring forward the potential for some CEQA streamlining in development projects. And specifically, if a project had an environmental impact report, there could be some streamlining areas for the greenhouse gas emissions area if a project was consistent with a region's adopted RCAP.
Okay, so there's really not and enforcement of this. It is an incentive to cities and county government.
That is my understanding at this time, having asked that question directly to folks that I would consider myself more experts than myself. But yes, my understanding is it's more of an incentive-based legislative area currently. Not to say that that couldn't change or modify as things tend to do, but in the current time, I believe that's where it is. And I'm to want to be very clear on that. I will ask that question again and make sure that we as staff go back and look at that. I'd like to be able to provide a more certain answer to the board as it pertains to that area. So.
Well, it helps me in determining the structure of the committee.
Mm-hmm. Good. Great questions. Thank you, Board Member Jake Jorgensen. Appreciate that. Anything else? No. I will say it reminds me of watershed work. If you have a watershed council that's a stakeholder group and you have a watershed plan, it's not required by the state. But if you're looking for grant funding, it puts you at the top of the list. And I would give Trinidad as an example, where we formed a Trinidad Bay Watershed Council about 18 years ago, and we've leveraged over $25 million in Trinidad for the pier replacement, working with the rancheria, for stormwater runoff, sediment control on Green Diamond resource land, septic tank repair and replacement, you name it, we've been doing it. And it had everything to do with us being at the top of the list because we had those underlying plans in place, right? Whereas the city of LA said, no, we're going to hire our lawyers to fight you. And they didn't get all those monies. We outcompeted all kinds of communities in coastal California by getting out in front of it, right? By having a good plan, incentive-based, that then allowed us, when the economy comes back again, it always seems to swing, we would be in a great position to be able to take advantage of those things. At least that's my understanding. So I think you hit it right, but I appreciate you following up on that. So again, back to the list, whether or not it's the PAC model or the TAC model, I suspect many of us probably want to see more information, perhaps. I don't know if anybody has a strong feeling one way or another.
No, they both seem to have, a lot of merit to me, and the distinction between the two of them might be a pretty fine distinction. So I think we should kind of go forward looking closely at both of them, and we can refine it as we go along and decide on one or the other based on a little more information or advice from other experts. And
Others?
Agree.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Looks like agreement there. And number 4, any other direction for staff? Please.
Well, it's not quite direction, and I don't know how well I can formulate my comment, but referring back to public comment with Rocker, and I think what I might be understanding in some of the emails that we received is the idea that is this also a point where HCOG does consider expanding beyond transportation so that there's a clearinghouse, if you will, for all things climate affected? And it sounds like, if not us, then who? And that who would be the county.
Yeah.
So maybe not obviously not a full discussion now, but that might be something to consider in the future.
Well, it certainly is one of those questions you brought up, because we are venturing into new turf when we enter into, like you said, energy and all kinds of other things, which is why the recommendation is to include some of those experts in a TAC model, et cetera, even in the PAC model to some degree. But the point well taken. We're at a lot of pretty important junctures as a society, I would say, frankly speaking. And so I doubt this is the last time we'll be discussing these things. So, but thank you for that comment.
I have a question more out of curiosity, and the answer might not be available in this room, but I noticed that in the 350 Humboldt example, Sonoma County had a special legislation passed that allowed them to do the kind of committee that they have down there, and that was in 2009. And I'm wondering if any other of California's 52 counties have, since 2009, taken that path also and had legislation so that they could have a sort of a hybrid committee or.
My sense is there's got to be other examples, and even if they're not strictly climate related, there's subjects of regional importance all over the place that have probably caused boards, collective boards, regional entities to be creative in how they put together an advisory body or ultimately an approving body. So I think in either event, the direction I'm at least feeling from the board at this point is, right now we don't know enough to pick one or the other. So let's explore all sorts of options and, maybe see their pros and cons, see how they could function, and really understand that a little bit more, including talking to our local agency partners and really just maybe honing in a couple of more developed recommendations that could be considered at a later date.
Okay.
Including a query of local areas in the example that was brought forward by our 360 Humboldt email that we
350.
received earlier today. 350, sorry.
That's okay.
That sounds good.
Great. Thank you for that additional comment then. So it seems like we're at that point where we said yes on number 1, continue to look at a leadership role. I think it was yes on number 2, which was, I'm sorry, can you pull those back up? Thank you.
Should we
Amy.
examine the funding structure?
Yes, examine the funding structure, right? Is that?
Yeah, that would be
Number 2.
explore a collective regional local agency funding participation
Right.
structure,
Right.
while keeping, of course, the budgeted money in place and in play
Mm-hmm.
if and when we change course.
And then number 3 was, well, we're not quite sure about which model. We'd like to see more information developed. And number 4 was look at other models like Sonoma County and others that are, as you mentioned, you're going to be looking at all kinds of other information and stuff. So with that, is there any more discussion from this board on this agenda item? Would somebody like to take a shot at a motion? Don't
Well,
need one.
Yep, it's a discussion. There you go.
Perfect. You've gotten the
Discussion
feedback
only.
that you needed?
Absolutely, and I really do appreciate the discussion and the thoroughness of it, and it's very much what I was hoping for. So
Great.
thank you.
Well, your staff report was very helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you both for that. Okay, with that, we're going to reconvene the HCOG board, and by motion, we will reconvene the board and approve the PAC recommendations, which there were none, I guess. So we're just reconvening the board. Is that correct? By motion?
There was an action item for the carbon reduction program.
There was. That's correct. Thank you very much for that. All right, so can we have a motion to reconvene as the HCOG board?
So move.
And does that include approving the PAC recommendations?
Yes.
Okay, motion by Jorgensen, second by Kenny. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed? None. Motion passes unanimously. Great. And HCOG staff and PAC member reports, the executive director's report.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair Madrone. I do have a couple of items that I'll move through here as part of my executive director report. I will start with acknowledging, and the board may remember at their March meeting, you approved the formation of an ad hoc committee that would review potential RTP policies for helping leverage grant funding through the RTP and through the STIP. I believe about a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, we did hold the first ad hoc committee meeting, and they developed some initial thoughts and some initial framework that staff are currently working on as it pertains to that area. We're hoping that we can maybe have 1 or 2 more meetings as staff continue to develop a draft of what that policy would look like before making it to the TAC for review and ultimately a potential recommendation up to the board, and then to the board from there. So the board may get a report out on that, or even that as an item for consideration prior to being potentially included in the RTP update as early as August or maybe September. A couple of other items that we've been working on the last few weeks. So the SS TAC and the TAC have been presented and provided the opportunity to comment on the Measure O spending plans. The TAC received the spending plan presentation from County Public Works Director Tom Madsen, and the SS TAC received the spending plan recommendation from Greg Pratt with HTA. And so both of those are onward and upward. I believe the Public Works version of that has already made it to the Board of Supervisors, and I'm sure the HTA work plan will follow. As a general heads up to board members and their agencies, we at HCOG have received our what they are calling our pre-draft regional housing needs determination from HCD. Of course, that is going to feed into the allocation process, which HCOG will jump into largely in the next 6 months, hopefully, not hopefully, but culminating in a regional apportionment that is brought in and approved or recommended by this board to go to HCD after that. So, like I said, it is pre-draft at this time. It has been shared with local agency staff, and we have began to convene some meetings as what we're calling the RENA working group, which includes HCOG staff and the community development staff from all of the regulated agencies in that. So more to come. I would also like to note that we are very happy at the staff level that our associate planner Stevie will be returning from his leave, where he went overseas to obtain an advanced degree in planning in Spain. He will be back at the end of July, and we'll be happy to have him running with a number of these grant projects that we have going on right now with the North State Hydrogen, with our Vision Zero Action Plan, and with our Zero Emissions Fleet Transition Plan. And lastly, as a plug or a shout out, as part of the Vision Zero Action Plan, which is a grant that HCOG is leading regionally with our member agencies right now, we do have Smith Group and our out-of-town GHD area consultants. They have come in for a series of workshops and meetings with our local agency staff to kick off that project. And that does include a community meeting tomorrow at the Wharfinger building from 5:30 to 7. That is really focused on public outreach and kind of Vision Zero presentation and public comment, kind of at the infancy stages of that project, if you will. So again, that's open to the public. By all means, everybody is welcome to come and really get on the ground floor and provide some comment on our Vision Zero plan that we're putting forward. And that's 5:30 to 7:30 tomorrow, Tuesday, the 16th of June at the Wharfinger building here in Eureka. And that, of course, is not the only opportunity. It just happens to be the first opportunity. 17th. I was reading the date on my computer. Yeah. Thank you.
Any questions on the executive director's report? Seeing none, Caltrans reports.
A few updates. The Ferndale Access Project will be completing the project initiation document before the end of this month. We'll have a public meeting that's scheduled for July 22nd at the Ferndale City Hall. The 2025 10-year plan projects, our asset management team is beginning the project nomination process for the next cycle of Caltrans SHOP projects. There are opportunities to provide project feedback and become involved. Our team presented to the TAC members this month and shared a survey that's now live. We plan to come back to the August meeting at this group and report on the survey input and future projects for the Humboldt County, or projects for Humboldt County that are proposed for the last 5 years of the 10-year plan. Hydesville pedestrian enhancements. We're planning an in-person open house in July for an HM4 pedestrian safety improvement project. The project looks at the use of a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, among other features, for State Route 36 near Hydesville. The Eureka Slough Bridges, there'll be a virtual public meeting sometime in July to talk about the proposed Eureka Slough Bridge replacement project. We're finalizing that date soon, and there'll be more information on our website. And we anticipate award announcements this Friday, June 20th, for the 25-26 Sustainable Transportation Planning Grant Program. So we're waiting to hear announcement for HCOG's Lolita Safe Routes to School and Connectivity to Tribal Lands Grant. And if applications are unsuccessful, we encourage agencies to work with us and reapply next cycle, which will happen this fall. And last, the June Caltrans milestone report, I think, was recently shared with our current list of projects. So if there's any questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, PAC and board member reports. And do you have any additional HTA PAC member reports beyond what you shared already?
Well, I probably mentioned almost everything, I think. I just think it's really interesting how we're able to, with HTA and the planning process, to think about putting together a new system, which would be called North State Express Route. And I think that's going to be valuable for individuals and being able to connect up with Greg Pratt has been working on this and how to connect up with every other county down the road so that you can get to the SMART train and you can continue on. So this is something that he's been working on for quite some time, and our first connection is to Ukiah, of course, to Mendocino. And I think this is something we will look forward to as it becomes better and better. We are getting comments from over on the east side of our county about how can't we get involved in this? You know, we're out of Reading and we want to work on all these connections of other bus systems along the way so that you don't have to wait an hour for it to come when you're coming from Reading and going, well, wherever you're going, Arcata, Eureka, wherever you might be. So that's something that's going to take a while to put all that together. But I think it's exciting to be able to think about it because, you know, we have bus systems that don't want to be here, like we don't have Greyhound anymore. They're gone. And what Amtrak would like to do is not be here either. They would like us to be able to provide everyone that wants to go south to take them to Ukiah. And then in Ukiah, they pick up the Amtrak bus. So there was all these obstacles or people not wanting to do things anymore and trying to figure out how we can actually accommodate people living in this county and living north of us or east of us and make sure that there is transportation available.
Great, thank you.
So do you have any questions for me that I might be able to answer?
Okay, any questions for? Okay.
Well, thank you. You know, I would say it's nice to see all of you.
Yeah.
Some of you haven't seen in years. Some of you I don't know at all. So thank you. I do serve as the mayor of the city of Arcata also, and I am the vice chair of HTA. And so thank you. And I'm sorry Stacy was unable to come tonight. I'm sure she would have enjoyed this conversation, and I will tell her as much as I can about what happened. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much for being here. Any board member with anything to report? Seeing nothing, I believe we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.